This is The Joe Gaither Show on BamaCentral.com.
Good afternoon, Tuscaloosa, Internet World, West Alabama. How are we doing today on a Friday? The last Friday in the month of June. So your off season is slowly creeping along. We appreciate everyone for jumping in and joining us today on this Friday edition of the Joe Gaither Show on Bama Central and BamaCentral.com. You're watching us on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. You're listening to us probably on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, or on Amazon. We appreciate everybody who has subscribed, rated, and reviewed the show on those podcast platforms. That's my favorite place for you to consume the show. We are going to have a fun show today. Hopefully have a fun show today. We're going to bring on my friend Will Miller, writer for BamaCentral.com, and really writing all over the Walsh Writing Network. You can follow Will Miller at RealWBMiller on the Twitter machine for all of his takes. And Will Miller is going to be joining me next month out in Dallas for SEC Media Days. Will, good afternoon. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Joe. Really looking forward to SmackDown at Madison Square Garden tonight. Should be absolute scenes. Other than that, been a pretty chill morning so far, so hoping for a good day ahead.
Oh, man, you're reading my mind. I, too, will be tuned in to Friday Night SmackDown and probably tweeting things that don't make any sense to the Alabama faithful followers that follow me at Joe Gaither6. But if you like wrestling like Will and I do, we'll be checking out SmackDown and Money in the Bank next week. So that's not what these people want to hear about. Why don't we start with Alabama basketball? We threw out several basketball topics in our text chain, and yesterday at the end of the show, I teased a few topics. So let's start with Collin Sexton. Collin Sexton at the Rick Whitfield Celebrity Softball game last week. And obviously, the Rick Whitfield experience seemed to go off very, very well, despite tickets being in the thousands of dollars. It seemed like it was very full and a very fun event. But Collin Sexton, just a little, they had little media availabilities with all the who's who. He says this. The first question was simple enough. How do you feel about the program's progress? His quote, I'm excited. I'm excited to see how far we've come from the simple fact that all it took was for me to get there and get the ball rolling. At the end of the day, sometimes somebody has to be the start of it. So to clarify, is Sexton taking the credit for this? He continues, I'm taking all the credit. I feel like I was the first top 5, top 10 player to go to Alabama in a long time. A lot of the guys who are top 5, top 10 would go to a blue blood or some of the higher name schools. And I just wanted to change it up and I wanted to be different. I wanted to go to a school that was going to allow me to be me. And Avery Johnson, he's an amazing coach. So let's take that packaging and ask ourselves, or ask you, Will Miller, is Collin Sexton the reason for the Alabama basketball resurgence over the last 4, 5, 6 years?
I think his remarks have kind of forced that discussion because if you look back, I mean, he was the blue chip recruit, that came in and people might have been surprised. I remember Coleman being a little over half full for the, Tide tip-off event for people to get their first glance at him. And that was, while he was suspended for the first game of the year. So that was going to be your shot to see him for the time being at that point. That was back in October of 17. But I mean, the excitement around the program that followed him, it was supposed to be the renaissance of the Avery Johnson era, which we know that didn't happen. But he did change the level at which the Alabama brass perceived the basketball recruiting ceiling. And there is something to be said for that because that ceiling's elevation has resulted in many more great players, talents, prospects following Collin Sexton. Now, granted, there were good players between Collin Sexton was a one and done. There were good players, between Collin Sexton and the Final Four, a lot of really good ball players. I think of guys like Kyra Lewis and Herb Jones, first and foremost, that were there in those intervening years when Collin, and it wasn't a long time, but after Collin Sexton left and in between Collin Sexton going to the NBA and Alabama truly breaking down the doors in basketball and becoming one of the elite programs. He was not the only player instrumental to Alabama's success, but he was the marquee recruit that helped elevate that ceiling. Now, if you belong to the school of thought that suggests that the elevation of the recruitment has been the main driver in the program's success, then you might be inclined to stand behind those remarks emphatically.
Oh, let me just see one thing real quick. Today's Friday. Oh my gosh, I messed up something. Oh man, give me one pause real quick as I fix something real quick. Will, my question, I'm going to throw this to you as I fix something on the BamaCentral website. Is what about? I mean, of course, Collin Sexton. He was the superstar recruit, but the program really didn't. It still faltered. It still was floundering. It still was in this kind of, okay, they barely made the tournament in Collin Sexton's year, and then Avery Johnson gets fired, losing to Norfolk State the year after. It took quite some time for it to really pan out. So where's the connection point between Collin Sexton and the Final Four performance this past season?
Well, that's the big question, I think, in this discussion, and as it relates to what Collin Sexton said, because like I said on the previous answer, I think that it depends on what you believe about the state of the program. You know, if you believe that the recruiting ceiling rising beyond what anybody could have imagined is the main reason for what happened this past year, then that's what you think. You think, yes, Collin Sexton should get the credit because he was the guy that did get the ball rolling. He put it pretty well. But again, he wasn't the only guy that was instrumental to that success. I mentioned some guys. I failed to mention John Petty in the previous answer, and he's a guy that, you can't gloss over. And the year Collin Sexton was there, he wasn't fully developed yet. Neither was Herb Jones. I don't believe Kyra Lewis was there at all. I think that year, though, they go to the tournament for the first time in 6 years. And, at that time, making the tournament every year was far from a given. They were perennially on the bubble, next four out come the second week of March. And it seemed like a cycle almost. They would, be in the beginning of February, decent shape, right there on that 8-9 line on, bracket projections or what have you. And then they would slip out because they drop a couple games down the stretch. And in Collin Sexton's year, I believe they lost their last 5 regular season games in a row. And that's not a good look for any team from a momentum standpoint. They were able to get that win in the SEC tournament because of Collin Sexton's late game heroics against Texas A&M that ultimately vaulted them to a win over Auburn and then a definitive spot in the NCAA tournament. But that kind of depends on what you think. Do you think it was the recruiting? If so, you probably agree with Collin Sexton. And I don't think that what Collin Sexton said is entirely incorrect. I mean, somebody does have to start it. You have to start somewhere. Every great run has to start somewhere. There's one defining moment where the ascent began. Is that Collin Sexton? I think Collin Sexton's play on the court could be considered that. Like I said, there are other guys very important. I don't necessarily fit into that line of thinking. I think that the moment was hiring Nate Oates. Of course, I've been a huge Nate Oates guy since he was at Buffalo. So, I lay claim to the fact that I was the only person in my high school who'd ever heard of him when he got hired. And I think, it's how these moments come together. The recruiting is Collin Sexton, the coaching is Nate Oates, and it's how it all comes together. You build a program, right? Now that, Rome wasn't built in a day. I think ultimately that's the fact you have to look at. This didn't come together overnight. It didn't come together solely because of one guy. He was a big part of it, but, not 100%.
Okay, I'm with you there. I think he was a big part of it for sure. But to me, it was not just Nate Oates. It was Javon Quinterly. I can remember basically Javon Quinterly unhappy at the Villanova in the transfer portal, and it's Nate Oates really saying, okay, we can give you a home. And I was working at, and maybe this is personal bias, but I was working at a local restaurant downtown where they were having dinner, watching Nate Oates court the Quinterly family. And JQ was, well, I mean, how highly recruited was he? Javon, he was a 5-star recruit, Javon Quinterly, 24/7. Let's see, he was a 5-star recruit at, was he a McDonald's All-American as well? I think he was at Villanova. So to get the response basically from, you buy in with Nate Oates, you get him, you get him basically initially, 5-star recruit, number 3 player in New Jersey, a top 30 player in the country. He transfers in, and you deal with all the, okay, is he going to be able to be eligible? And then he worked through some of that. He sat out like the whole year, and basically showed faith in Nate Oates, to where I think JQ is really kind of the spark. Maybe Collin Sexton is the log that went on the fire, the first log on the fire. But Javon Quinterly, to me, sparked that fire and got things going. And so, I don't know. I have a little bit of, and maybe this is just my contrarian nature, Will. I have a little bit of a hard time really giving all the credit to one player, giving all the credit to one person, because of really the cumulative effect of, well, yes, you got young bull Collin Sexton, and that was a very exciting season, but it didn't really, as far as success goes, didn't really pan out successfully. And Avery was fired, 18, 19 months later, and you had to restart everything. So I don't know. I am glad that Collin Sexton feels connected to the program in that way, that, okay, I was only there for 1 year, but I do feel a strong connection to Alabama. But I just have a hard time giving all the flowers to one person.
Well, I see where you're coming from. I really do. It's hard for me to say that, he shouldn't have. I mean, if you're an Alabama fan, you wonder where the program would be if it wasn't for Collin Sexton. You do, because you wonder if the program would be able to recruit at as high of a level, to entice talent at as high of a level. Sexton, obviously, before NIL, lots of things look different, before the portal by a little bit as well. But it wasn't thought of that Alabama was a destination for recruits like Collin Sexton, major players in the high school sphere and the recruiting trail. And then he comes along and he shifted the narrative a little bit. Did it lead to seismic change in the way of, an immediate deep run or winning, 25, 30 games? I know there's a big gap even between those numbers. I'm just generalizing, because Alabama didn't even win 20 games that year. I don't believe, or they certainly didn't in the regular season. I believe they were, anyway, they were like 8-10 in the league or something. So, and that does, the paradigm changes when you have a guy like that come in for the first time and he's drawing that attention. And
do you think that he feels this way because of what the rest of the recruiting class did, the Herb Jones, the Alex Reese, and John Petty recruiting class did? Because they stayed and they became a part of really they were the double championship winners, the first double championship winners in the Nate Oates era. Do you think that he feels this way because of kind of how that recruiting class panned out as a whole?
I wonder about that because they went on to have a lot of success at the college level, but Collin Sexton, top 10 NBA draft pick. And, that's another, Alabama's had a lot of these NBA draft picks, a lot of first round NBA draft picks, and presumably a few more in the near future if some of these guys, these top level recruits, pan out like a lot of people expect them to this upcoming season and beyond. And that's the precedent Collin Sexton helped set. I think the vision was different. Once those guys got 3 years, 4 years deep into their college career, they bought into a completely different coach, a different system, and the goals were different. I mean, the goal wasn't to win a national championship when Collin Sexton was around.
It was to get to the tournament consistently.
It was, and you got to, but your goal with Collin Sexton was to get to the NCAA tournament, maybe rattle off a couple of wins, be in that Sweet 16 round, maybe a couple balls bounce your way, you go to the Elite Eight, and at that time, that was the absolute ceiling that Mark Gottfried was able to do. Back in 2004, a great run, but it wasn't. You didn't have championship aspirations. The COVID year when that team rattled off 10 straight wins and ascended to a top 10 ranking, which at that time, I think everybody, was taken aback by that in and of itself. That the top 10 Alabama ranking, was not the norm. And we've seen that for many weeks since then. But it was clear that team could go do the whole thing. You never had those thoughts with Collin Sexton. You never had those thoughts with Avery Johnson. I'm not one of those people that's going to bash Avery Johnson at all, but that's just not where things were at that point in time. Collin Sexton or not.
Whew. You're a better man than I am. Avery Johnson was a very good recruiter, obviously, with the evidence that we've already talked about. But golly, his in-game coaching decisions really, really, really drove me up the wall. So you're a better man than I am, Will. You want to transition past this topic and talk about Nate Oates talking to Mark Gottfried this week?
I think it's a good time to do it, yeah.
Mark Gottfried had a little bit of has a podcast and has a great guests on his show. You can check it out on YouTube and wherever podcasts are. But Nate Oates was on his show, and Blake Byler wrote a piece. We're going to be hanging out around a lot of Blake Byler's pieces for the rest of the show, the next 10 minutes or so. Blake Byler wrote a piece about Nate Oates' comments saying that he wanted to go to a football school because of the way that college athletics has been going over the last 5 years and will go over the next 10 to 15, and beyond financially. And I just think that is, well, I'll ask you, what do you think about those comments? Nate Oates saying, okay, when I'm leaving Buffalo, I wanted to go to a football school, and I tell our recruits hey, you're at an advantage for going to a football school.
Well, I'll tell you this. Nate could have picked anywhere that particular year that, you didn't. Now, you didn't have the jobs come open that you did, for example, this past offseason, when you had Kentucky, Louisville, Michigan come open in the same offseason. That'll never happen again. You're not talking about those kinds of jobs. Roy Williams was still at Carolina. Krzyzewski's still at Duke. But, aside from that, he could have gone anywhere in the country that had an opening after winning 32 games in Buffalo, being a consistent, not just tournament appearances, but, tournament wins. He'd won a tournament game the year prior to winning those 32 games, and he had a MAC team as a 6th seed. This was a guy that, and he made $2-something million a year back then, which he's, doubled that now when he was first hired at Alabama. And he could have gone and made that almost anywhere else. But you're told, for better or worse, that the two revenue sports in collegiate athletics are football and men's basketball. And, that's shown itself to be true, again, for better or worse. That's led to a lot of, for lack of a better word, honestly, collateral damage for some smaller sports and in some other areas and for smaller schools, unfortunately. But that's the way the machine has gone. And I don't know if Nate Oates could have forecasted the change, just the amount of changes that came about after he jumped ship at Buffalo and came to Alabama. But given that did happen the way it did with NIL and everything else, I think that Nate Oates has a tremendous advantage being at a school with the brand that Alabama has, the global recognition that Alabama has, and yes, the football pedigree that Alabama has is going to drive some of that. It's going to drive some of these changes. I've said that a lot. How much was Nick Saban's success? I'm not saying with respect to NIL or the portal specifically, but how much did Nick Saban's success change the overall landscape of big-time college football? And by virtue of that, unavoidably, the rest of college sports as a whole, he did that at Alabama, and that's the brand that, he helped reinvigorate. That's the advantage that Nate Oates has. He's part of that brand now. Who are we to say that he might have been wrong? I don't think he was.
Well, I just find it so indicative of Nate Oates' mindset and the way that he thinks about nearly everything. I mean, you think on the surface level, oh, basketball coach, I want to go to a basketball school. I want to be the man. I want to be, Duke, North Carolina. I want to be at UConn, and everybody bows down to the basketball program, of course. I mean, we all grew up on stories on Bear Bryant at Kentucky. Bear Bryant leaves Kentucky because he gets a watch and they give Adolph Rupp a nice car. Like, oh, man, that's a classic college athletic story. But it just shows me just kind of the way that Nate Oates thinks about, okay, let's go deeper. Yeah, I might love to be bowed down to at a Duke, at a North Carolina, at a UConn, whatever, at a Kentucky. But what's the biggest advantage? And then he explained it really, and Blake Byler wrote about it. The advantage is the revenue built by football will bleed into basketball, and then basically the success of the football program gives you great recruiting weekends to kind of recruit to during the height of basketball recruiting is in that first fall semester. So it gives you a lot of great events to go to. And I just find it so fascinating that, okay, I'll opt to go be a great number 2 program on a campus. And look, let's be honest, I love the basketball program, but they're never going to overtake the Alabama football program. Even if I just talk about them every single day, they're not going to overtake the Alabama football program. Abby, please. Abby's trying to get involved in the show. I'm sorry. They're never going to be involved, be eclipsing Alabama football. So I just find it so fascinating. This is, okay, I will be able to use it to my advantage. Not to say, I mean, look at UConn. They have no football program of note. And yeah, Kentucky has gotten better, and North Carolina and Duke have both had some pretty good years. But these programs are really still, the basketball programs are still really the 1A program on their campus. And I just wonder, you think about the new practice facility that just got approved at $56-60 million. And Kentucky's job opens up and we got to give Nate Oates a raise and jump up the NIL. You've got all those resources in the bucket because of what Nick Saban has done and because of what Kalen DeBoer will hopefully do for the university. The football program basically just supplements its basketball program. And now that the basketball program has proven itself to be very successful on a national level, I just think it's just a little glimpse in the analytical mind of Nate Oates.
Well, I'd like to raise a few things, actually. Number one, look at the level of a recruiting tool that the football program is for students in general, and be it out of state, be it international, whatever the case may be. I know a number of people myself from out of state, far out of state, and I'm from the Birmingham area, and that came largely because of Alabama football. And why can't that translate over to basketball? If you're pitching the Alabama football program to a prospective student that's not an athlete, who's to say that can't be pitched to a basketball recruit? And obviously that's had some success. We've seen that. Second off, Nate Oates had the chance to be around great coaching when he took the job at Alabama. And, no disrespect to Buffalo, an institution that I like, they don't have Nick Saban. It's only one place that had Nick Saban, has Nick Saban. And there are many other great coaches around the Alabama campus. He did so much. I mean, we can't even begin to underscore that on this program. I mean, I use him as the general example. One of the many great coaches at Alabama that he had the chance to learn from and see how that process went, how he did things, how he ran a program that's been as successful as any collegiate sports program on planet Earth. And that's very valuable to someone like Nate Oates, who is making the jump to the Power 5 for the first time. That's extremely valuable. And third, and lastly for this point that I'm making, you don't have to be the football program if you're Alabama basketball. You don't have to. You don't have to win close to 20 all-time national championships, to be considered on that elite level. You don't even have to win 10 of them. I'm sure the fans would love it. I shudder to think, based on what the Strip was like in the NCAA tournament run this past spring, just what would happen, because people would be, all over the place celebrating this program and getting in on the excitement that the program has generated. over an extended basis. And Nate Oates has proven that he's committed to, having that success on a year-to-year basis, not just a flash in the pan over a couple of weeks in March. But it still can be a very elite program without reaching the heights that the football program has had. And Nate Oates knows that. And he knows that no one reasonable has the expectation that he match what the football program has done. It can't happen. It's not going to, but he also knows that's not the expectation.
All right, we only have a couple more minutes with Will Miller. He's got to get on to other business obligations for the day. Will, let's close it out with Blake Byler's newcomer breakdowns. You've got newcomer breakdowns of Cliff Amore, of Aiden Holloway, of Chris Youngblood, and on Thursday he did Houston Millette. So he hasn't really touched the freshman quite yet. So let's start with these guys. And let's combine it with what Grant Nelson said. Grant Nelson had comments pretty recently talking about LeBaron Philon being a standout player, and Cliff Amore just really anchoring the Alabama defense and interior. Which newcomer of the transfers are you most excited to see this season?
I feel like there was a lot of buzz around Chris Youngblood that has, I don't want to say tapered off, but maybe he has been somewhat overlooked as we've talked about some of these other transfers and freshman prospects that, like I mentioned earlier, I think are going to be really good. I mean, this is another strong addition to this team from South Florida, and, the local kid, I mean, that's obviously an important piece as well, and was an important piece in bringing him to Alabama. He's a guy that I think could turn some heads and surprise some people, and I'm excited to see what he's able to do. This team is as deep as any team in the country. Obviously, one of the favorites to be preseason number one. How many people thought in 2018 they'd be saying that about Alabama basketball? I'll wait for a hand in the air and not see one. But I think that any one of these guys could be a key contributor on this team, whether they're starting, whether they're getting key bench minutes. Depth is going to be one of the main factors of any success that this team has. He's going to be integral to that. He's a really good basketball player. I mean, I have a soft spot for the mid-majors too. That's been discussed a lot on this show as well. But that's a guy that I'm looking to be a potential surprising newcomer for a lot of folks.
Well, Will Miller's flying out of here. He's going to SmackDown tonight. Be safe getting up to New York. We appreciate your time. Make sure you go follow Will Miller at Real WB Miller on the Twitter machine. We'll catch up with you next week, and we'll start talking about some plans for SEC Media Day. Thanks for your time, Will.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Wish flights weren't so egregious. I actually would be going. I'll see you soon, man.
Absolutely. That's Will Miller joining us. Okay, maybe he's not going to SmackDown tonight, but we'll be watching it. Let's get out of here just by highlighting something that's about to happen in 1 hour. At 1:30, if you're watching this late, at 1:30, Dijon Lee, 5-star cornerback out of Mission Viejo, California, is announcing his commitment, and Dijon Lee is expected to be committing to the Alabama Crimson Tide. He's going to be deciding between Alabama, Oregon, Georgia, Southern California. He's got a small bevy of schools right there in his top 3, top 4. But I think that Alabama is going to get good news, and it's probably, with no disrespect to Keelan Russell, and yes, Keelan Russell continued to impress this week by winning the Rivals quarterback camp. It's no disrespect to Keelan Russell, but Dijon Lee is going to be, if he does commit to Alabama, the highest rated commitment in the class of 2025. So the recruiting hot streak after getting Dawson Merritt this past week. You're up at 9-10 commits in the month of June. You're sitting there with the number 2 overall recruiting class for the football program, and the recruiting just continues to stay on fire as Dijon Lee, ideally, I think everybody's expecting Dijon Lee at 1:30 to commit to the Alabama Crimson Tide. Blake Byler's already got our piece written up, and we're waiting to kind of send it off when he makes his announcement. So I'm going to get out of here for the day, and I'm going to get prepared for that commitment and enjoy the rest of the recruiting this weekend. I think it will continue pretty well. And there's not the official visits are over. It's dead period, so nobody's coming on campus right now. but I think that more announcements are imminent. And so we'll be all over it right there at BamaCentral and BamaCentral.com. It's been a fun week with you guys hanging out on the Joe Gaither Show on Bama Central. We are basically trying to get every show and every topic in its own silo. All the Alabama stuff is right here on the Joe Gaither Show on Bama Central. We've got content for San Antonio Spurs coming up later. That's going to be the inaugural episode of the Joe Gaither Show on Spurs Central with Matt Guzman today. We'll talk about Stephon Castle. That'll be on its own little show, its own little podcast, its own little platform. You can search that up in the same platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Amazon. So I'm going to get out of here for the day and prepare for those other two events, and we'll talk to you next week right here on the Joe Gaither Show on Bama Central and BamaCentral.com.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of the Joe Gaither Show on Bama Central. Keep up with Joe on all his social media pages at Joe Gaither6. Subscribe, rate, and review the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and be sure to read us daily at BamaCentral.com.